Behind the walls of a federal prison, chaos erupts. Flames rage, a furious mob takes over, and all order breaks down. FBI negotiators and tactical units are pushed to their limits, working nonstop in a desperate bid to avoid all-out war and save nearly 100 hostages. Back in the 1980s, the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary held around 1,800 Cuban detainees. Out of these, about 400 were serious offenders, and 200 suffered from mental illnesses. I'm Jim Carlstrom, and I used to head the FBI's New York office. At the time, Fidel Castro referred to these men as undesirables, but to the U.S. government, they were prisoners. In 1987, these detainees staged a violent rebellion. The FBI's elite units were called in to take back a prison that was quite literally on fire. Their mission? Stop the violence before it spiraled completely out of control. Let's rewind to Cuba in 1980. The country's economy was crumbling, and political unrest was boiling over. In a surprising move, Castro allowed Cubans to leave the country for the first time in his rule. Soon, U.S. boats were arriving at Cuban ports. Over a 5-month period, more than 120,000 undocumented Cubans fled to Florida. Under U.S. immigration law, about 2,700 of those new arrivals were classified as criminals or mentally unstable. With America's prisons already packed, officials had to get creative. Thousands were sent to a federal prison in Oakdale, Louisiana, while nearly 1,400 were relocated to the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. For 7 years, Cuba and the United States struggled to come to an agreement about sending these detainees back. Then, on November 20th, 1987, a deal was finally struck. 2,700 Cuban prisoners would be repatriated. The news spread like wildfire within the prison walls. Almost immediately, riots erupted in Oakdale. Inmates there took 28 guard hostage. Meanwhile, in Atlanta, everything still seemed calm for the moment. Joe Petrowski, the prison warden in Atlanta, recalls that there was a certain level of mutual trust between inmates and staff. The prisoners who behaved themselves were treated fairly in return. But things were about to take a dark turn. On the Monday following the announcement, an officer named Ted started his morning shift. The atmosphere was eerie, unnaturally quiet. The breakfast area, normally loud and packed, was almost deserted. It was a red flag. In the prison's workshop, located on the first floor, inmates were busy making mattresses. Everything seemed routine, until suddenly, guards were attacked and fires were set. The chaos spread quickly to all floors. From upstairs in the woodworking shop, staffers Menier and his supervisor were helping supervise furniture production when the situation exploded. Shouts echoed through stairwells. Inmates burst through doors, wearing makeshift masks fashioned from gray T-shirts with holes cut for eyes. Ted tried to call for help, but one of the prisoners slammed the phone from his hand, sending it flying across the room. For the guards trapped inside, it was their worst nightmare come to life. Although they always knew this kind of thing could happen, deep down, most never truly believed it would. They were used to working with inmates every day. It became normal. And when something becomes routine, you tend to forget just how dangerous the people around you really are. At that moment, the guards were outnumbered, unarmed, and facing a mob armed with makeshift weapons. One staff member managed to alert Warden Petrowski about the unfolding disaster. Inside the prison walls, none of the guards carried firearms. That was a deliberate policy. The risk of a weapon falling into the wrong hands was too high. The only guns were secured in the watchtowers. With no time to waste, Petrowski called the FBI and the regional prison director. He filled them in on the rapidly worsening situation. Meanwhile, the fire spread like crazy, and the inmates forced the captured staff into a locked tool room, barricading the door behind them. "We really thought we were going to die in there," one of the staff members later recalled. There was no way out of that metal cage. The uprising wasn't just contained to one area. It quickly took over the entire prison complex. Furious inmates overpowered guards, stole their keys, and took more hostages. They began unlocking cells and setting more prisoners free. The situation had completely spiraled out of control. The inmates were now pushing toward the main cell block, but the guards managed to lock it down just in time. cutting them off barely. As smoke and flames continued to engulf the building, nearly 100 correctional officers and prison employees were trapped inside. The Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, built at the turn of the 20th century, was the largest federal prison in the United States at the time. From the outside, it looked like a fortress, surrounded by massive 12-meter-high concrete walls. The prison sat on 121 hectares of land, with the building itself covering about 11 of those. Petrowski needed to know where his people were inside the sprawling facility. Guards stationed in the towers had a clear view of the yard. They took note of every person they saw, both inmates and staff. That information helped the command center compile a list of employees who were likely being held hostage. Ted and a few others were still locked in the tool room, now surrounded by flames. Some inmates tried to convince the Cuban detainees guarding the room to open the door, likely so they could kill the hostages. But the Cubans refused and forced them to back off. There were a few scuffles, but the door remained shut. The fire, however, kept advancing. The Cubans had no choice but to move the hostages to another part of the prison. To get there, they had to cross the open yard, fully visible to the watchtowers. As they made their way across the yard, a guard in the tower took aim. One of the Cuban hostage-takers was shot in the head and killed instantly. 5 others were injured. Bullets flew dangerously close to the hostages, forcing everyone to take cover. Eventually, the inmates led the hostages to the prison chapel, where they were locked in a small room. It was chaotic, loud, and terrifying, but for now, they were alive. Within an hour of the initial outbreak, FBI agents from the Atlanta field office were on the scene. The FBI oversees all federal crimes in U.S. penitentiaries, and this crisis was now a top priority. Warden Petrowski met with Special Agent Ron Kennedy. His first questions were urgent. How many hostages are there? Are any of them hurt? Where are they being held? Inside the prison, emotions were running high. Many of these inmates had spent years locked away, some serving life sentences with no hope of release. Now, they were free to roam the prison. For them, it felt like a twisted kind of celebration. Leon Blakeney, who led the FBI SWAT team, knew the situation was completely unstable. His face was kept off camera to protect his identity. Nobody really had a clear picture of who was in control of what, he said. We didn't even know how many hostages there were or how many inmates had joined the uprising. The prison housed 2,500 people, and now they were running wild. It was total chaos, and it had already claimed 1 life. Special Agents Kennedy and Blakeney began strategizing on how to regain control of the facility. Luckily, they started getting vital intel. It came from 2 sources: agents stationed outside the prison perimeter and inmates inside the facility who wanted no part in the rebellion. These informants told the FBI where inmates were gathering, how many were involved, and what kind of weapons they had. Unfortunately, the rioters had seized the guards' radios, jamming up communication channels inside the prison. The FBI and prison staff had to quickly switch to a secure radio frequency. Reports suggested there were 4 main leaders behind the uprising: 2 white inmates and 2 black inmates. Negotiations would now become the most critical part of the response. Enter Special Agent Rosario, the FBI's lead negotiator. His job? Try to talk reason with people who were clearly operating on pure rage and fear. Their demands were outrageous and totally unrealistic, and they wanted everything right away. Rosario's first challenge was to get them to calm down long enough to even have a rational conversation. But that wasn't going to be easy. The inmates were furious, especially after a guard had shot and killed one of their own. That incident came up again and again. "You killed one of us," they kept shouting. Rosario let them vent. He even had them brought to him so they could speak face to face. They wanted him to react emotionally. For men came out to negotiate, but it quickly became clear they couldn't speak for the entire inmate population. Certainly not for the 1,400 Cubans still inside. Back in the command center, Warden Petrowski received a call from a group of 16 staff members. They had barricaded themselves inside Cell Block E, which housed Atlanta's most dangerous inmates. These prisoners had been isolated for a reason, to keep them from hurting others. If the rebels got to them, the results would be deadly. One of the men locked up in cell block E was Thomas Silverstein, one of the most feared inmates in the entire U.S. prison system. Some in the Bureau of Prisons called him the most dangerous man ever to be incarcerated there. They described him as a ruthless killer with a deep hatred for prison guards and the system itself. Silverstein had been locked up since 1975 for bank robbery. Over time, he'd racked up multiple life sentences for murdering another inmate and even a correctional officer. He was violent, calculating, and obsessed with one thing: escaping. The staff in cell block E were in grave danger. Agent Kennedy and the FBI SWAT team put together a rescue plan. They believed they could sneak into the prison without being seen by climbing over the 12-meter high wall. But for that, they needed proper gear. Kennedy called in the Atlanta Fire Department and requested a National Guard helicopter. Their idea was to use the helicopter as a distraction, drawing the inmates' attention to the far side of the prison while the SWAT team slipped over the wall and moved in. Hours after the uprising began, the operation kicked off. With everything in place, the FBI SWAT team launched a daring mission. Their goal was clear: get those 16 prison staffers out of cell block E before it was too late, and without putting the nearly 100 other hostages in greater danger. All right, people, we'll position a vehicle on the southwest side and take the ladder up from there. Everyone clear on that? The team nodded. It was go time. Everyone knew the risks. If the Cuban inmates caught wind of the rescue attempt, the entire plan could fall apart. Worse, they might retaliate by executing hostages. The SWAT team climbed over the prison wall and headed straight for cell block E, the heart of danger, where the prison's most violent offenders were held. Their approach had to be silent, fast, and precise. Everybody out, let's move. They quickly reached the staff members and led them to safety. Heads down, IDs ready. They filed out, relieved but still shaken. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of the yard, 27 more prison employees were trapped inside the prison hospital. They had barricaded themselves in, helplessly watching as their colleagues were rescued. Some of them called out desperately, "Get us out, too!" But the team on the ground knew one thing for sure: going back for a second rescue wouldn't go unnoticed. The element of surprise was gone. If they tried it again, the inmates would be ready, and the cost could be deadly. That's when things got even worse. Inmates broke into cell block E and released its inmates, including men with the most dangerous records in the prison. Now, armed killers were freely roaming the halls. By the time night fell, 3 buildings were already reduced to ashes. Nearly 100 prison guards and employees had either been taken hostage or were still in hiding. Ted, one of the original staff members captured, was being held inside the chapel. A man appeared at the window. He wasn't one of the Cubans. The inmate next to Ted whispered, "That's Silverstein." He walked into the room, holding a flashlight, scanning faces one by one. When the beam landed on Ted, Silverstein stared. "Don't I know you?" he asked. "No," Ted replied quickly. "We've never met. You sure you don't know who I am?" Silverstein pressed. He looked like something out of a horror movie, cold, intense, and dangerous. Ted could feel it in his bones. This man wasn't normal. Thankfully, before anything could happen, other inmates called Silverstein away, and he left without hurting anyone. On the second day of the uprising, Danny Coulson, the FBI's tactical commander, arrived at the prison. The noise was overwhelming, like a swarm of bees buzzing nonstop. You could feel the energy, the tension. It was everywhere, Coulson said. Back in 1982, Coulson had founded the FBI's Hostage Rescue Team, HRT, a special unit trained to handle high-stakes crisis situations. They were the FBI's elite force for terrorism, hostage rescues, and riots. Basically, when all hell broke loose, they were the ones to call. But this time, the HRT was already busy dealing with another prison riot in Oakdale. That left Coulson with limited resources and a very tough decision. Federal prisons are built to keep people in, not to allow rescue teams to come in. The doors are reinforced, the gates are steel, and everything is locked down tight. That made planning a rescue even more complicated. Coulson knew he needed military-level support. The first team he thought of? Delta Force, the U.S. Army's elite counterterrorism unit. But there was a problem. By law, the military isn't allowed to intervene in civilian law enforcement matters. This rule, known as the Posse Comitatus Act, has been in place since the Civil War, so the FBI would have to handle it themselves. Kennedy began pulling together SWAT teams from across the country, Chicago, New York, and nearby regions. His goal? Be ready to launch a rescue mission in under an hour if the order came down. But they were on a razor's edge. If the inmates found out an attack was coming, they wouldn't hesitate to kill the hostages. That's why Agent Rosario and the rest of the negotiation team worked so hard to avoid confrontation. But even their best efforts were hitting dead ends. The talks were going nowhere fast. None of the rebel leaders Rosario had spoken with had enough influence over the entire prison population. The FBI needed a new strategy, and fast. So Rosario and his team started asking prison staff a critical question. Which inmates do the others actually respect? Who had real authority among the population? The staff gave them a short list. The FBI reviewed their files and selected 5 or 6 men they believed could be key to restoring order. They approached these inmates directly, calling them by name and inviting them to the negotiation table. To the FBI's surprise, the men agreed. This marked the beginning of the first serious, productive discussions. The top demand from the Cuban inmates? They wanted individual hearings from the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service. In short, they were begging for a chance to stay in America legally. Rosario agreed to pass the request to the Department of Justice. At the same time, the FBI did something smart. They handed over sacks of unopened prison mail to these inmate leaders. Why? Because in prison, mail is everything. It's your link to the outside world. The gesture helped establish the inmates' credibility with the others. They were now seen as people who got results. Finally, momentum was shifting, but the clock was still ticking. Back in the prison hospital, the 27 staffers trapped inside were running out of time. Inmates had started trying to smash down the doors with a battering ram. One of the hostages inside managed to contact Warden Petrowski, who immediately informed Special Agent Kennedy. Everyone knew it was only a matter of time before the rioters broke through. And there was something even more terrifying. The hospital stored powerful medications and narcotics. If the inmates got their hands on those drugs, the consequences could be deadly. Kennedy called in his tactical commander, Danny Coulson. I told him straight up, Coulson recalled. We can get them out. We'll go over the wall, hold off the mob with a barricade, and extract them. But there was one huge risk no one could ignore. The inmates were watching live news coverage of the standoff on television. They knew what was going on outside. If they thought a rescue mission was underway, they might start killing hostages immediately. So Coulson faced a terrible dilemma. Launch a rescue and risk a massacre, or wait and possibly doom the 27 trapped inside. Kennedy had to make the call, and it was brutal. Based on everything he knew, he decided the risks were too high. He called off the mission. When he relayed the decision to the Bureau of Prisons, one of the officials snapped. If those were FBI agents in there, you'd go in and get them. Kennedy didn't flinch. No, he said, I wouldn't. But privately, he couldn't stop asking himself, did I just sign the death warrant for 27 innocent people? Then, things got worse. Contact with the staff inside the hospital was lost. Petrowski leaned into the radio. This is the warden. Can anyone hear me? Silence. Worse still, guards in the towers reported seeing inmates carrying gas canisters into a basement area. From there, they could access utility tunnels under the prison, including the ones running directly beneath the FBI's command center. Danny Coulson immediately realized the threat. If those tanks exploded, the blast could wipe out their entire operations team and possibly give the inmates a way to escape. Without wasting a second, the FBI prepared to move into the tunnels. The tunnels beneath the prison served 2 major purposes. They carried utility lines, things like heat and electricity, and they also doubled as ventilation shafts. At first, they were tall enough to stand in, but as you moved deeper, they narrowed down to just inches in height. Coulson and SWAT leader Leon took their teams underground, not entirely sure what they'd find. They had no reliable maps, no communication, and no backup. It was a total blind mission. What they did find was chilling. Cuban inmates were already down there, searching for a way out. Sometimes, the agents came within mere feet of them, but fortunately, every time, the inmates turned away and avoided confrontation. After hours of searching, the team never located the rumored gas canisters, but they were convinced the tunnels were being used to explore escape routes. So, they made a tactical move, stationing different SWAT units, including the team from Chicago, in strategic tunnel points to monitor inmate movement. Then, on day 3, the FBI finally got a major break. Agents using high-powered binoculars from outside the walls spotted movement. Nearly all the hostages had been relocated into one area of the prison known as the American Dorm. That gave the tactical team something it desperately needed, a clear target. Outside, crowds had started gathering. Family members of hostages and inmates alike, desperate for news. The media swarmed the scene, broadcasting live coverage around the clock. That's when a simple mistake nearly cost lives. Special Agent Rosario remembers it clearly. FBI SWAT teams were doing a shift change. 2 large groups of agents in full tactical gear were walking up the steps of the administration building. Standard procedure. But a local reporter saw it and jumped to conclusions, live on air. "It looks like the FBI is preparing to storm the prison," he announced. Inside, the inmates were watching news, and they panicked. They dragged several hostages into the yard, doused them with gasoline, and held up lighters. "Come in here," they shouted, "and we'll light them up." Just like that, one false report almost led to a mass execution on live TV. Rosario's team scrambled to calm things down. "We're not coming in. We're still negotiating," they insisted. But the damage had been done. The inmates no longer trusted the FBI. "Liar, you said you weren't attacking." Everything was about to go up in flames. The agents moved everyone back to what they called the Green Line, their last defensive position before full assault. One wrong word, one wrong move, and it could all end in tragedy. After 3 agonizing hours, the negotiators managed to ease tensions. The hostages were spared, for now. That moment was a huge wake-up call for Colson. The next small spark could blow the whole thing wide open. It was time to raise the stakes. Colson went straight to the president, who gave the green light to bring in Delta Force. The elite military unit disguised itself as an FBI team to avoid legal issues. They brought everything: advanced explosives, reinforced cutting tools, even a fully equipped mobile hospital, ready for anything, including battlefield surgery. As Delta Force monitored from sniper positions, they installed hidden surveillance cameras to get eyes on every corner of the prison. The Cuban inmates were now working around the clock, crafting weapons out of scrap metal. Spears, blades, each one of them had at least 2 weapons on them at all times. Delta's recon team discovered that one of the tunnels led directly to the prison's main control room, just steps away from the American Dorm. They moved into that tunnel. Suddenly, only a thin window separated them from the hostages and their captors. That single move changed everything. It reduced their reaction time from 30 minutes to 10 seconds. Then came the final twist. A guard in the tunnels heard drilling noises. It was Thomas Silverstein, the prison's most dangerous inmate. They believed he was trying to dig his way to freedom. The team geared up and re-entered the tunnels to intercept him. Wading through waist-deep water, they discovered something unexpected. The tunnel was completely flooded. No one could be in there. Turns out, Silverstein's voice had traveled through ventilation pipes. He was still inside the prison, and still a massive threat. Rosario made a bold move. He told the Cuban inmates the truth. Silverstein was a danger to them. 2. You want this to end peacefully? You need to hand him over. And they did. 100 Cuban inmates stormed the area where Silverstein was hiding, dragged him out, and tossed him at the agent's feet like garbage. They later confessed they drugged him with sedatives mixed into a fruit drink because they knew he'd drink it. That moment changed everything. It showed the FBI that these inmates didn't want to kill the hostages. It also proved they were capable of working with the authorities if they believed it was in their best interest. Soon after, a similar prison uprising in Oakdale was peacefully resolved when the U.S. government agreed to review the immigration status of each detainee individually. Rosario presented the same offer to the inmates in Atlanta. They agreed, but still didn't believe the FBI would actually use deadly force. In fact, they thought they could overpower them. To shut that idea down fast, Colson staged a bit of theater. One inmate asked to speak privately. Colson agreed and used the moment to make a statement. As the inmate turned a corner, he was met by a wall of heavily armed SWAT and marshal units, fully geared up and looking mean. "This isn't going to be swords versus nightsticks," Colson told him. "We will use deadly force." That was all it took. On day 12, the inmates surrendered. The hostages were released. Not a single one was harmed. It was a massive victory, not just for the FBI, but for the families who've been waiting for almost 2 weeks to hear their loved ones were safe. And while the standoff was over, its impact lasted much longer. The story of these Cuban detainees and the nightmare they endured finally reached the public. Many were given the hearings they were promised. Some were released. Others were returned to Cuba. But one thing was certain: their story would never be forgotten.